esta semana es que no ha sido el mantenimiento, no ha sido la obsolescencia ni la falta de controles lo que ha desembocado en el accidente, por desgracia. Si no, sería bastante más sencillo de entender qué es lo que ha pasado y también de resolverlo. No estamos ante un problema de falta de mantenimiento, no estamos en un problema de obsolescencia y no estamos en un problema de falta de inversión. Estamos ante otro problema que tendremos que determinar, me temo que mucho más complejo de lo que nos estamos en este momento imaginando, me temo. Probablemente un problema que nunca hemos vivido antes en nuestra red, que nunca se ha manifestado de esta forma y, por tanto, cuando al final lo hayamos esclarecido, tendremos que pensar muy bien cómo evitar que en el futuro se pueda producir algo tan singular como lo que ha acontecido en este caso, ¿no?
The words of Oscar Puente there, the Minister for Transport and Sustainable Mobility in Spain. Look, there's been a lot of misinformation flying around over the last, well, since Sunday, since the horrendous crash in Adamuz. I'm pronouncing it Adamuz. It's probably Adamuz. On Sunday evening, in the 5 days in between, I had a theory on Monday morning that I put out that with the evidence that came out, particularly that photo of the broken rail, that no evidence since has come out has suggested that theory is anything other than spot on. As I said there's a lot of other stuff that's flying around, and I think it's worth going through. But what Oscar said there, for anyone who doesn't speak Spanish, what Puente said there is, it is not a problem of lack of maintenance, nor obsolescence, nor lack of investment. He cannot say that. He does not know that. And it is also not true based on the extremely likely mechanism that the derailment took and is the trigger that caused the derailment. He also says it is probably a problem we have never experienced before in our network, which is absolutely impossible and rubbish. For a minister to be saying this is the most egregious bit of misinformation I've seen so far. For anyone watching this who thinks I'm, just someone who is anti-left-wing, I'm a socialist. Hello. So I'm coming at this from the position of a socialist who just wants politicians to speak the truth. Anyway, let's go through. There's a few things that we're going to go through. There's quite a lot to get through. I'm going to go as quickly as I possibly can to keep this a fairly tight episode. So, first of all, a kind of an obvious warning that this video is going to include descriptions and images from a severe rail crash. So just a bit of a warning there. So we're going to go through a few things. First, the derailment. A quick reminder. We went through this in Rail Natter a couple of days ago. My weekly podcast, for those who don't know, where we went through this in a bit more detail, but I'm going to fly through this as we go. So, about a kilometre south of Adamuz depot is a rail break, or rather a fracture that has not broken. We now know that it wasn't a broken rail, but it is a fractured rail that probably that was manifesting at the railhead that broke as the train went over. But we'll get there in a second. So, the Irio 6189 approaches northbound. The southbound Alvia is coming, 2384 is coming in the same direction, on the same spot. Both trains, at the moment, the information I have is that both trains were going about 200 kilometers an hour. The permissible speed, the speed limit here, speed restriction here, 250 kilometers an hour. The Irio passes over the break, or the fracture, turning it into a break, which in turn disintegrates. By the time the sixth cars, the final three cars, but the sixth car reaches that break, it is now a gap in the rail, and those rear three cars derail, likely to the right, so into the cess, as it's called in British English. Meanwhile, the train goes forwards. That train, very rapidly, within the space of less than a second, comes into contact with the crossover going between the right-hand and left-hand tracks. It's a facing crossover, which then pulls those derailed vehicles across. We'll look at some of the damage indicating that this happened, across back from the cess into the 6 foot, so the space between the two tracks, and indeed into the path of the oncoming Alvio, which, the Renfe service, the white train, which collides with the rear cars of 6189 and very rapidly come to a halt following a secondary impact with the rock face. The majority of injuries, fatalities in that location. So, 6189 then continues, coming to a rest another 600 or so meters beyond the wreck of 2384. So that is the process by which the crash happened. What's the timeline for this? This image, by the way, is extremely valuable in explaining what was going on. You can see almost everything, almost all of the important features are within this photograph. So back down here, that I'm highlighting in yellow, you can see where the rail break is. You can see fairly little damage, although some warping of tracks, but very little damage as the area was coming this way. This, by the way, this direction is north, I should say. So you can see the crossover here, which is the area where the bogey will have, the rear three cars will have been pulled back across into the path of the Renfe service. Likely that the collision actually will have occurred up here, so around this location, because you can see damage across both tracks. So the slewing, basically that first collision, you can then see all the track materials going off from here as the front vehicle, now completely destroyed, of the Alvia, the Renfe service, slid off down here. What I suspect happened is that the deflection of the vehicle happened with more than just a glancing blow with this rock face, which you can see has been rubbed, kind of lots of scratch marks from heavy contact with this rock face and broken loose rubble, and a lot of debris, heavy debris of material that's just been dumped from the disintegration of that first vehicle. Absolutely horrific collision. So I think what's happened is that the first two cars of the Alvia have gone straight off here, heavy collision. The first completely disintegrated, the second here having rolled over, which in turn has pushed the third car this way, and the fourth has been then almost entirely intact but derailed, given the track materials it flew over would have been disintegrated. So that's how that course happened, and that will have happened in a matter of seconds. Meanwhile, the Irio continues on with the damage to the rear three cars. So the point at which the first wheels of the Irio service passed over the rail brake and went forwards is between 3.5 and 7 seconds, depending on the position of the rail brake relative to and the collision relative to the third car, how far the third car's got up here. It's very difficult to get exact positions here without full measurements. So nominally between 3.5 and 7 seconds. But from the point at which the sixth car begins to derails and the collision with the Alvia, the southbound service, is between 1.5 and 2 seconds. So the point at which the driver, now sadly died, killed instantly, I would hope, the driver of the southbound white Renfe service, as soon as a second to 2 seconds to see what was going on, not enough time, barely enough time to do anything, and potentially not even seeing it happening until that collision. But absolutely a passenger in that situation. So we're talking in total at maximum 9 seconds, which I think has been talked about in the official records, but potentially as low as 3.5, 4 seconds. So that's relevant because that timeline is relevant because we talked then about the drivers, the Irio, the northbound train, the Irio drivers' calls. There's a lot being made of these and say, well, the driver hadn't noticed there was a collision with the Alvia service. Well, the Alvia service, well, let's put it this way. There are two calls made by the driver. The first was during the derailment. So as soon as the derailment happened, the driver is making a report saying, because you can hear the emergency brake, it's kind of alarm going off in the background. I wouldn't recommend anyone goes to listen to this. This is a recording that really, there's a reason why recordings like this aren't made public. There's something traumatic about a victim of the crash, very much a victim of the crash, someone who will suffer PTSD for the rest of their life. Certainly a severe mental impact from this incident. But anyway, two calls. One immediately saying there's been a derailment, block all lines, like this, drop pantographs, switch off the electricity. There's been a derailment, without knowing the impact has happened. The impact, by the way, from that call will have likely already happened. And also people saying, well, why didn't the driver see the other train coming? Well, as soon as the derailment, that first bang, with the maybe 3.5 to 7 seconds before the major derailment happened. So the first bang without derailment, the driver will have instantly been hearing that bang, looking down at the instruments going, oh, what's happened here? Quite reasonable to miss a train approaching at speed going the other direction. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing. And also, you get, when you've been through trauma like that, you also have, your memory creates strong points and weak points. You get patchy memory. It's not unreasonable. First call, something has gone wrong. I've had a derailment. Can you drop the power? Second call, having stopped very little later on, the vehicle having stopped, driver's clearly gone to inspect the train, or gone back through the train, seen that there is damage and injuries, reports back, very rapid turnaround, reports back, I'm blocking I'm blocking the other line, ensure that all trains are stopped, please send emergency services. So that driver just absolutely professional, doing everything that they can to make sure the vehicle and all rail vehicles are safe. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's what we can learn from there. So bearing in mind, okay, how's the driver missed the other train? Well, no idea. It pitch black, so that train is in the dark. Bear in mind, get rid of that emergency light that's been put up there, the one that you can see, and this is just pitch black. No light at all. There's no fire. That train will have just been obliterated into nothing. There's nothing to catch fire. They've just been obliterated into bits, and just silent and in the dark. So no way for the driver, even if they'd walked down to the back of the Ireo, to actually see that 600 meters back necessarily. This distance, you can see the distance there. That's a long distance in the dark. Also, without any obvious sort of track damage, which will come back later, that's relevant. You can see that there's very little in the way of track damage on either roads at this point. So, which will become relevant with some of the other hypotheses that have been coming up. So, and the other thing is, like, that crash, that incident will have happened. The collision, the time from the actual derailment so to the collision will be seconds, very small numbers of seconds. So and you can see here again, this is the point at which the collision will have happened, because beyond here is good. The track is in good condition. So this is the point at which, and you can see the damage trajectory. So then the collision with the collision with the rock face here, and then the bits of that first vehicle, basically the remains of that first vehicle. It's horrifying, frankly. That first car of the Alvia here, in what remains of it, with a much more intact, very impressively, frankly, intact second car, and then the third and fourth car is much more significantly intact. Really, you can see that what will have happened is this second car will have been, this orientation will have actually flipped round, which in turn will have launched the third car up over the top. You can sort of see how the ballistic mechanism of these first car will have come straight off, hit this with enough to just basically send the remains of that first car. Second car will have followed it, but been pulled along such that it's sort of gone down here, sort of second car is sort of the front, and then slid upwards. Or perhaps potentially the front is this end, and then it's kind of gone from here to flip round, either mechanism, which in turn has then pushed the third car this way. So this is not me over sciencing. I can't tell exactly what that is, but you can sort of see how the investigators will piece that ballistic trajectory together. We'll get to the investigations later. So the second collision itself, let's talk about it. So you can see here I'll tell you one thing. One of the things that's been talked about is, the second train collided with the stationary first train. This is impossible, because the track materials here are very visibly intact. You can see here, up here, you can see that the track materials are intact up to this point, which means that the impact happened from here onwards. This is from this point onwards that the second collision occurred, which means that the rear three cars of the Ireo got this far. You can see, we'll get to some more images soon, but you can sort of see there's a few key features. Firstly, that the switch is set for the through route, not the diverging route, which helps debunk some statements later. But also you can see broken sections of the actual crossing nose. You can see breaks in the rails here, suggesting a pathway for derailed bogies, for the wheels of the derailed cars, potentially going through that, deflecting that way. They're indicators of what. How the rear three red cars deflected into the path of the Alvia. Again, likely. I'm not saying this is definitely what happened, but it's very likely, given the evidence that we see before us, that this is how this unfolded. And so impossible for the collision to not have happened in kind of down at this location with the rail brake down here. By the way, so you can see down here, you can see the rail brake, so you can see the sort of fairly short distance. From that, you can see the fairly short distance. It's not a great distance. And this comes to this lost bogey that's been talked about a lot in the news as some sort of smoking gun. No, it is not a smoking gun at all. It is this thing here, this bogey. This is a bogey. In the US, they're called trucks, but in British English, they're called bogies. And you can see that the bogey is missing from the rear car of the derailed Ireo. What does that tell us? Well, not a huge amount, to be honest. At this point, lots. Oh, by the way, this thing, it's not entirely sure where I've seen like 6 different locations where people think this thing is, but the one thing that connects them all is that it is a great distance from the tracks. It has been sent a huge distance, whichever direction it went. It has been sent a huge distance, and that happens during crashes. Less so with modern rolling stock, but certainly if you look back to any of the sort of major rail crashes in the UK involving HSTs, Intercity 125s, those bogies are very poorly attached to the rest of the rail vehicle, and they go flying. They weigh about 5 tons, and they become very dangerous ballistic projectiles. Well, only one bogie from the area was let loose, was fired loose, and my suspicion is that has happened as a result of energy being pushed through the vehicle, and that has actually absorbed some of the energy and that bogey flying off as part of the collision. But that bogey, there's been some discussions that the bogey itself is what the Alvia collided with. That doesn't match any of the damage. It doesn't match the behavior of the Alvia train. If the report later then analyzes and says, yes, that is what happened, I'd be very surprised. Let's put it that way. Why do I think that? Firstly, before we say that, is this bogey the one from the Alvia? Just because it's missing on one doesn't mean it is. Well, yeah, there's a few things that match. You can see the layout of sort of steel cuts of these sort of single hole there and the double hole there, and then the square cut very much matches the bogey that was on the other end of the of that end car of the area, so of the Freccia 1000. So you can see this bogey is very likely to be that missing one, right? But the vehicle itself, for the bogey to have disappeared off, the bogey is missing on the final car, but there are 1, 2, 3 derailed vehicles, cars 6, 7, and 8 of the area, and so for the bogey to have come off and caused the derailment of the collision with the Alvia doesn't match up, not least because the damage to car 6, which is where I believe that initial severe collision to deflect the Alvia into that rock face will have occurred. The damage to that vehicle is not a glancing blow. This is a severe collision which will have sent ripples, shockwaves through the final 3 cars. The thing that's most spectacular is that the coupler survived between cars 6 and 7. This is car 7 that we're looking at. The collision here is severe. This is severe damage to a very strong vehicle body. This damage will have been enough to deflect the train. A bogey on its own would not have been. The other thing that's important to say is it is impossible, I should say, if I could briefly get my face up, it is impossible for a train to shed a bogey without having derailed first. What's the mechanism for that to happen? How does it, for a bogey to come loose, it needs to, the vehicle car needs to have lifted up, and that bogey then needs to have some lateral force to take it off the rails. How is that happening? How is it possible? It cannot be just ripped off in shear somehow, even by a crossover. You'd have the whole vehicle being pulled that way, not just the bogey on its own. The connection between vehicle and bogey is too strong for that, because it has to be to manage curving forces. So that there is no mechanism for that bogey to have come loose on its own. It is a secondary effect of the collision. Let's talk about the broken rail itself. So again, come back to this picture. You can see the broken rail up here. This allows you to then see, this is the first thing, the first bit of visible damage. So the first indicator of anything happening in terms of the crash kind of going this way. That's the first indicator. And again, you can see that crucially, that the track materials up to this point are intact for the Alvia. So the collision for the Alvia started there. The broken rail itself, this is that close-up picture. This was the smoking gun image that told me a lot of what I needed to know. Again, crucially, these are welds. You can see there's a weld here and a weld here. I don't know, it might not be clear to everyone, but you can see the sort of lump shape. So you can see that the rail is broken adjacent to, not at, but adjacent to the weld. That's quite natural. A weld is composed, we'll show a picture in a minute. In fact, we'll save until that point. So there's the broken rail there. There are, as episode 29 of Rail Natter from God knows how many years ago went into, because you can tell because it's all the old branding, there are 100 different ways for railway rails to fail, like just enormous different ways for railway rails to fail. But in this instance, we have indicators of what's happened. So we know that it was at a weld. You can see here the weld, sort of the edge of the weld running kind of here. So you're at a weld location. There is a weld there. you can see so this is not absolutely conclusive, because this is a fairly poor photo with a watermark over it that's been snapped from the telly. But you can actually see a dark mark in the middle of the rail web that is replicated in one of the pieces adjacent to the broken rail here. That dark mark looks like a fatigue failure. So previously I'd said I wasn't sure. I didn't have enough evidence to say whether it was a break from maybe a cold weather snap, or whether it was a fatigue failure. This photo, this image, inclines me towards a fatigue failure, combined with another piece of evidence, which is the fact that other trains before this, the Irio, there maybe a couple of other trains within an hour of this train had marks on their wheels indicating some discontinuity in the running surface, which might have been a manifestation of a not broken but a fracturing rail. And it was this train, the Irio 6189, that was then the last straw that broke the camel's back. But you can see a few things here. You can see this light colour is indicative of a brittle failure that will have happened under this train. So those are not tracks that have existed before. They will have happened under this train very suddenly. Any dark marks are things that have been there for a little bit longer. If they're really dark, then they might have been there for a long time. Fractures manifesting. Cold weather may have been a factor in this, though, because cold weather would exacerbate and grow those cracks. One of the things that's worth saying is that this, it looks like there are potentially only three pieces here. This looks a little bit like it might fit in there, and that surface might fit that surface. That might well be, because of the cold weather, that's how much difference from stressed rails. So when with continuous welded rail, when we weld them together, we actually pull the rails, pull them along and then weld them together to introduce a tensile stress to manage hot weather risks from, rail is basically, rail is one long thin thing. So you want to pull it, because as soon as there's a compressive force, it buckles. So the risk of buckling is very high, a very problematic progressive failure mechanism. Rail brakes are arguably a lower risk type of failure. So there will be a stress-free temperature. In the UK, it's 27 degrees. That is the point at which there is no tensile or compressive stress. If you break the rail, it will ping open in cold weather by a distance relative to the difference difference in length of the steel at 27 degrees or whatever the stress-free temperature is versus the ambient conditions. Here it was close to zero or very, it was cold weather. So that potentially could be that it's pinged open that much. In any case, you can see there are quite a few other things here that you can see. There is damage to there's damage here to the track materials. You can see broken concrete from pressure to the sleepers. You can see that this concrete sleeper here is disintegrated. Again, this is all fresh looking. It's all fresh looking damage that will have occurred during the accident. So quite a lot of useful evidence there about the rail brake. One of the things that is trickier to reconcile, and I'm finding harder to match up, is actually there doesn't look like there is a huge amount of damage from the rail brake into the actual crossover. It isn't quite clear. There's some indicative signs of disruption, enough for me for it not to dispute my theory. But I'm surprised at how little visible damage there is from the three cars having derailed, coming up and striking, kind of basically breaking through, for whatever reason, breaking through here and running on the other surface. So I'll be interested. That I'm a little more unsure of exactly what the derailment from the start of the seventh car and its derailment through to the sixth car, through to the collision of the end of the seventh car with the Alvia, exactly how the behaviour of the rear three vehicles went, I'm not 100% on. But it's not unusual. For example, this was a couple of episodes ago, we looked at Audenshaw in Manchester as a freight derailment, much lower speeds here. But it shows a similar mechanism that might look familiar, of a derailed vehicle actually running on the web of a broken rail. So what happened here is actually a torsional twist that snapped the rail at a weld. We'll get to why I don't think that was the case in Adamuz in a minute. But in this example, you can see there's a train coming along. For whatever reason, go to the episode to find out, the train was derailed and it actually dropped down and ran in the web, and that could explain why that damage doesn't quite look right. In kind of, there doesn't seem as much damage but also it was, what would it have been, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 axles running derailed. So that's not a huge number, and they're reasonably light vehicles. So yeah, I don't know. Talking of the way that vehicles run on track, lots of people talking about on-train vibrations, and historically there's a video I think from November last year and a few things about vibrations and reports that have come internally about train vibrations. Quite a few different things can cause vibrations, whether it's wheel flats, the top picture there, the middle picture there is railhead corrugation, the bottom picture there is cyclic top. Cyclic top generally is not the frequent vibration. Cyclic top can be, but it depends. You can get higher or lower frequencies based on what has instigated the cyclic top, and other causes besides. But vibration, the reason I don't think vibration is the cause here is because why would it have failed? So for vibration to have been the instigator of this failure, it doesn't match the behavior of the derailment. It doesn't match the type of failure we've seen for it to be a vibration issue that's caused it. Because why then are there other trains with a similar marking on the wheel? And also the IRIO has marks on the wheel indicating that this was a brake. So it doesn't map that this is a vibration issue. Related to that is ballast condition. A lot of people talking about ballast condition and corruption, this, corruption, that, ballast. Maybe, sure. But as a cause of this derailment, no. Here are two pictures. These are not from the derailment. These are just photos from elsewhere. Here is a picture of a failed weld, by the way. This one here. You can see the pattern of the crack. You can firstly see that the failure happens adjacent to the weld, not at the weld. You can see the way that the crack. You can see that light color from the brittle failure. You can see the way the crack propagates outwards. So you can sort of see that. But crucially, what you'll see from this failure is that the failure has happened and the ballast has not got this white sort of powdery color on it, whereas the failure below is a failure of it's a failure, probably a foot failure instigated from a foot failure, but the ballast here has been shaking for a long time because there is dust. It's got this pale color from dust from shaken ballast all over it. You can see that pale color, and that is an indication of a support problem. It could be a drainage issue. It could be the ballast, the formation condition is not, the actual treatment directly under the ballast is not good enough. There are a variety of reasons why you had those, ballast condition is one. Ballast, by the way, this stuff. Here's ballast. Is a granite one and a non-granite one. I think that's a limestone bit of ballast. Not so good. Yeah, two pieces of ballast. About what ballast? About fist-sized. These are quite small pieces, actually. Yeah, about fist-sized pieces of ballast. There's a whole lecture series on ballast and why it's brilliant. But the quality of ballast is very important. Particularly for this sort of railway, you actually want granite. You want a strong ballast that's got a decent ability to withstand loads. But the point being here, poor quality ballast would have left dust. And you can see here that there is a little bit of... So crucially, there is no dust on the other side of that weld. So for the weld to fail, you'd need to have the dust surrounding that area for the weld to have been stressed, whereas there isn't. What you can see is these little marks of dust, and indeed some kind of on the other side of the weld here. Those small patches of dust, I mean, firstly, it looks a bit like ice, so that's kind of one thing. But also, if it is dust, again, this is not a great resolution photo, if it is dust, that's because immediately after, as soon as that rail broke, you will have had this banging and twisting as the vehicle derailed through it. All the damage to the sleepers you can see here, all the sleeper ends that have shattered, and the damage to the tracks. You can actually, in this photo, you can actually see flange damage on the sleepers there. Anyway, so all this damage would have been bouncing this up and down, and it would have resulted in, it could quite easily have resulted in a little bit of this sort of thin layer of dust from just the crash, from just the massive impact. The dust that we saw in the pictures here is from running, lots and lots, thousands and thousands of axles running. The fact that this is only a few axles is because those loads are that much higher, and the train's actually smashed down into the ballast, so the sleepers will really have bounced up and down there, causing that extra dust. Yeah, so you can see those. Let's talk about weld installation and inspection. In the olden days, we used bolted joints, and we still do in a few applications, not least in block joints and other things. We used what's called fish plate, two fish plates either side of the rail, tucked into the web, bolted together. And as you can see from this picture, they have a habit of cracking, either the fish plates or, more insidiously, the rail ends with the bolt holes in them. This is just an inevitable consequence at bolted joints. They're extremely maintenance intensive because you have to unbolt them, re-grease them, set the expansion gap between the rail ends properly, and also the rails all. If you've got a rail like this in the UK, they're 60 feet long, at 18.288 meters. They all shuffle. You've got to shuffle them all back into the right place. It's very maintenance intensive. Plus, this happens under traffic. So they're bad. You want to get rid of joints. As much as you can, you want to get rid of bolted joints. And so welding is the right solution, the correct solution. And the welds we saw, you can tell that it's an aluminothermic weld by the thickness of the lump. So you can see the weld here that I've got. The thickness of the lump suggests that it's an aluminothermic weld. You cleanly discut to the kind of the rail, or you've got a cleanly manufactured end of the rail, and those then you set them the correct distance apart. You stress them, so you pull them together the right amount. You weld them. You put a mold around it, pour in the material, weld it, and you create a weld. The weld is from a kind of a novel, a new material. And then that you get what's either side of the weld. You get an area called the heat affected zone. Normally fine. There is a whole science to understanding rails and rail welding. There's a lot to it, but you install the weld properly, and if you do it wrong, you can change the crystalline structure in the steel in those and weaken those parts. But even so, those will be the weaker part of the weld. The new material in the middle is very strong. The steel connection either side is the weak part, whether it pulls away if you get the right level of bond between the constituents of the weld. Anyway, exothermic or aluminothermic or thermite welding looks kind of like this. This is one form. There's various different types. Pandrel, for example, who make the clip, the one that's behind my shoulder, have just refined thermite welding dramatically to kind of automate the process a lot and increase the quality of their welds. The very best thermite weld will only ever be as good as the worst flash butt weld. Flash butt welding, induction welding. There are lots of other types of welding that are used. This is the cheapest. And is arguably the most well-known form, but we generally, ideally you would avoid thermite welding, but equally very safe. It's fine. This is the way that we do it, and adequate levels of post-installation, during the installation and after the installation, and indeed before the installation, all the right checks to make sure that the quality of this is good enough. And then when you've put the weld in, things like in the UK we have the ultrasonic test unit, or we have multiples of these, that you can see these little kind of water-filled wheels. Those run along the railhead at speed, ultrasonically testing plane line to check for fractures, cracks, anything, and to a pretty small level of crack, you can pick this up with ultrasonics. There's other forms of testing, induction and others that get used as well, but ultrasonics is pretty well known and widespread and will have been in use, I would hope, on the Spanish network. In fact, I'm sure it has been. So from this, though, the question is, right, what are the standards for installation of and inspection of the welds themselves? What are the standards for routine ultrasonic inspection of rails? And if those, what are the standards? How do those standards compare to the rest of Europe? Were those standards being followed? If those standards were being followed and the inspections were happening, was the information about defects from the inspection units finding its way to the right maintenance teams? Were they funded appropriately, and were they given adequate management support and operational support to get out on track and replace any defects? These are the key questions. The fact that there was a renewal a year before raises questions of, well, was there a cool down period where there weren't inspections because it was assumed new track would be fine? That's not a safe assumption to make, by the way. But who knows? That's what the investigation, I hope, will look at. Let's talk about signaling and sabotage. God, it's going, isn't it? So, lots of bollocks going around in the news about all sorts. I just spotted another one saying, the bogey is the smoking gun. No, it isn't. There's another one about, there's discussion about sabotage, there's discussion about signaling failures, all sorts of rubbish. Let's start with signaling briefly. The signaling system played no part in this and could not have played any part in this collision. The time between the collisions was too small for the signaling system to be able to have safely identified and stopped the second train, the Renfe southbound train, 2384. Other key factors, people have said, well, did the signaling system activate the switch? In fact, there's an article talking about the fact, saying that that's what happened. Like, no, I see no evidence for that to be the case. You'd see a very different pattern of deformation. You'd see, for example, much more deformation at the toes of the switch. If it had suddenly deflected the train, you'd see this curvature looking much more deformed. Potentially the train would have run through, and that's just not happened. So that just doesn't match. Also, the switch here, you can see the switch is set for the through route. So that wouldn't have happened the actuation wouldn't have allowed that to happen, and the system wouldn't have allowed it to happen if the train had just run through it the wrong way. It would have been completely broken. So that's impossible to have happened under the train as it passed through. So the points have played no part in this. You can see the break in advance of the points anyway, and all the damage running up to it. So this is, points are intact. You've got all this damage suggesting the derailment happened in advance of the switch. Like that doesn't make any sense. And again, putting this picture up, you can see there's some deformation here in the switch, but crucially that it is set for the through route. It is not set for the turnout route. Sabotage. For someone to have done sabotage, suggested, there are suggestions, I don't know the details, that there was a sabotage took place on a Polish bit of railway where a bit of rail was cut out. Well, this is not a flame cut gap. Most of it is, again, that light colour from a brittle crystalline failure of the steel under extreme stress, not a cut mark and a ripply cut line through the steel, which would show up as a burned, blue, minimum blue stained sort of cut mark. So no. So that makes no sense. The other thing, of course, is if the rail had been cut, you'd have this gap for the whole train going through, and the whole train would have derailed, whereas the whole train did not derail, only the rear three cars derailed. So it doesn't matter. Sabotage is just not a fit here. It's not a fit here. And frankly, people who keep pushing it and suggesting there's some other thing at play are insulting the memory of the victims who rightly should be seeing truth, not bollocks being thrown around to understand what happened here. Let's end. This has gone a bit longer than I'd hoped, but I knew there was a lot to chew through. Let's end with the investigation itself and why I'm a little bit nervous about the quality of the investigation. So back in 2013, you had the Santiago de Compostela derailment, an absolutely horrific derailment that killed 80 people and seriously injured 100 or more, 125 possibly or more, 200 people. Very, very serious collision, high-speed collision, high-speed derailment around a curve. In 2014, so a year later, for those curious about how quickly the report might get turned around, CIAF, the nominally independent investigator, released its report into the derailment. 2 years later, after some shenanigans, the European Railway Agency released some advice to the European Commission regarding the strengths and weaknesses of that report. This we're going to look at because it's important too. So we're going to look at the detail and then just summarize very quickly. So key points here that are worth picking up. The composition of the investigation team that... So let's kind of pick up a few points here. Point one, the composition of the investigation team included traffic safety directors from the involved organisations, ADIF and REMF, so the infrastructure manager and the train operator, and INICO staff. INICO, one of the contractors involved, I believe, in this situation, or possibly operator. I don't know INICO, actually. So the requirement that the CIF shall be independent from any infrastructure manager or railway undertaking and from any party whose interests could conflict with the tasks entrusted to the investigation body was not ensured. Therefore, the investigation did not comply with the requirements of the Railway Safety Directive. The company also fulfilled the role of independent assessment body for one of the involved organisations, specifically in relation to the decision to export risks to the driver, further weakening the independence of the investigation. Emphasis on the report was put on the direct cause, one, human error, and on the driver's non-compliance with the rules, rather than on underlying and root causes. Those causes are not reported as part of the conclusions of the report and typically are the most likely to include the organisational actions of ADIF and REMF. The report focuses mainly on the derailment itself. The subsequent collision and fire and their impact are not sufficiently described. So, this is worrying. So the details of the subsequent collision and fire and their impact are not sufficiently described. So they don't actually look at the mechanism here. They're not critically analysed. No conclusions are arrived in the report. The report also fails to identify the wheel-set vehicle that derails first, which can also provide a better understanding of the accident and its causes. So I'm saying the investigation should tell us the mechanics of the derailment. Maybe it won't. The report does not sufficiently analyse and conclude on the decisions around the design of the line, including those made by DGF, and how any risks were assessed. Does not sufficiently analyse and conclude on the design of the rolling stock involved in the accident. So again, we'd expect to look at crashworthiness of the two rail vehicles. My view is that the crashworthiness looks very impressive of the Freccia 1000. And I think, frankly, pretty good on the Alvia, on the REM for Class 120. I don't... The fact the first vehicle disintegrated from the scale of force, but even the second vehicle is largely intact. The third and fourth entirely intact. It's very impressive, really, how much they held up as well, given the scale of the collision. But we should have an investigation that looks at that. Some key elements of which would be expected in an independent accident investigation regarding the involved organisations are not critically analysed and concluded, including human factors, safety management systems of involved organisations, risk assessments and their impacts, responsibilities and decision-making processes, the role of infrastructure and vehicle design in the consequences of accidents. I have to say that this is all stuff that is bare minimum things to include in a rail crash investigation. Those are all there. You don't get the chance very often to see the extreme ends of railway operation and vehicle behaviour in a situation like this, and this is where you learn most from. Sordid as it, unpleasant as it might seem to say, those people dying in that crash, we should take the chance to learn everything we can from the crash to ensure that their deaths and the impacted lives of the injured people and also friends and family of the people who died are not in vain. You want to learn everything you can. It's not an insult to go, well, we've learned this about crashworthiness, or, well, we've actually learned this about emergency service response, and so on and so on. The proposed safety recommendations seem to arise from the topics discussed and not from a well-understood and established causation chain leading to evidence-based conclusions. That's scathing. In this report, there is neither description nor evidence on whether, when, and how the victims and their relatives were informed during the investigation process and given the opportunity as far as possible to give comments. Crucial part of any investigation is to open up to all victims to say, if you want to come and tell us anything you want to come and tell us, do that. Come and tell us what you want to. We're here to make sure this never happens to you or anyone else in Spain again. So that's scathing. What are the conclusions that the ERA has? So 4 conclusions. The composition of the investigation team did not ensure the independence of the investigation. The emphasis of the report is on the direct cause and does not answer essential questions on root causes. The unanswered questions relate to bodies that were included in the investigation team, such as ADIF, INICO, REMF, and the functioning of DGF. The investigation body did not meet the requirements of independence set out in the Railway Safety Directive, and therefore the obligation to investigate accidents has not been properly fulfilled. In short, the agency considers that the accident in 2013 involving the derailment of a high-speed train resulting in 80 fatalities and 152 injured has not yet been independently investigated as required by the Railway Safety Directive. Furthermore, taking into account the very serious nature of this accident, the agency considers an investigation that meets the requirements of independence and addresses as a minimum the weaknesses identified, referred to above, and in the following report should be opened. So that was 2016. It's worth just bringing out a paragraph to just summarise what an investigation is about. The aim of an independent, in-depth investigation carried out by a national investigation body is to establish exactly what, how, and why the accident happened, and based on that to learn lessons for the possible improvement of railway safety and the prevention of similar accidents, and to limit the consequences. That's the point. So if you don't do all the things that were highlighted here, you don't achieve that benefit for the railway. It's critical that is done. So jump forwards 8 years from that point and 10 years beyond that report being released, and we have a new law being released. On the 1st of August, the creation of an independent administrative authority for the technical investigation of railway, maritime and civil aviation accidents and incidents. A new body merging the various, it'd be the equivalent of merging the AAIB and the RAIB and the MAIB in the UK. You're merging those investigators into one organisation. Ostensibly on the basis of a response to the failings of the CIAF, right? However, CIAF website doesn't exist, is down, and they have not created the new investigator, which means there is now no longer a way to access any of the previous CIAF reports because they've downed that website, and there is no new investigating organisation. CIAF is still the investigating organisation here, and crucially, whether or not it is the case that these people are independent or not, we have staff from REMF and ADIF in the investigating body again. This worries me. And given what the minister was saying right at the head of the episode, I think these are some of the big questions that journalists in Spain should be pushing extremely hard on to understand what level of independence the investigators are taking and whether this will be a deeply flawed investigation in the way that the Santiago de Compostela investigation was. I severely and sincerely hope not. A very brief addendum, because just as I finished recording that, CIF released a kind of an interim findings or their kind of initial findings note confirming that it was a rail break thanks to marks found on wheels of the Irio and several a few trains beforehand. matching that with the rail brake as being the initiating factor of the derailment. Also pointing out that the wheels ran in the web of the rail, as I just told you all about a second ago. So basically confirming everything that I've been saying. So kind of allowing you to be like, oh, maybe he does know what he's talking about, and also reassuring me that maybe I know a little bit what I want to talk about. But and they say, that in the fair play so far, they've said we've been unhindered and we are independent. But again, the rail brake is not the beginning and end of the investigation. They need to understand all of the reasons why that's been allowed to happen, and also all of the behaviour of vehicles and emergency services and staff beyond that point as well. There's so much more that needs to be investigated, cognizant of the complaints of the ERA 10 years ago.